Recently, Lloyd Austin was asked if the United States wants to create an alliance system similar to NATO in the Asia-Pacific region. And he said that the answer is positive, that the United States wants to make an alliance in Asia-Pacific region. And the question is this: when you look at the war in Ukraine and what has happened during these 2 years of war, in your opinion, are we getting to the point that the conventional war between superpowers is not any more affordable for any of them?
I don't think that this conflict will reach the point where there will be nuclear, personally. I probably am too optimistic, maybe, but that's my nature. I tend to be an optimistic person. But if you think about it, I don't really think it will come to that point, because at the end of the day, the guy who is supposed to press the button at the end, these guys tend to be rational, or let's say if the guy itself is national, it's another question, but they tend to be advised by people who tend to be rational. And if you look, for instance, at what is going on in the US, when you look at the assessments that were done during the Ukrainian conflict, you would see that those who were the most rational were the military people. The Pentagon was, in fact, the most rational in most their approach. Of course, the thing is that the military is supposed to implement what politicians say, but they also have to provide the advice when it comes to technicalities of the conflict. And there you see that in many cases, and that applies to the US in that situation, in the Ukrainian situation. I think I would trust the US military in being more rational than the politicians. I'm more afraid of the politician than of the military, because we see also in the assessment, if you have followed the various assessment of the war in the last 2.5 years or so, we see that the military tends to have a more rational and factual approach to the conflict than the politicians. So I tend to be optimistic, because I think that at the end of the day, the guy who is supposed to take the responsibility of launching the first nuclear missile, this guy will probably be rational. And as a result, probably we will not reach that point. But it's equally true that the West has understood that they are not able to cope with the Russians in a nuclear conflict, in nuclear war, or in a conventional war, sorry. And in fact, that's probably also what the Russians wanted to demonstrate in the way they waged the war in Ukraine. Because when you look at the profile of the Russian commitment in Ukraine, you will see that the Russian army is built for the defense of their country. It's not built to wage war somewhere in the world. It's built up to defend the nation, the Russian Federation. It's a defensive, it's clearly a an army that is built for the defensive posture of Russia. So that means, if you look from the other side, that the West would be very much poorly inspired if they would like to attack Russia. So Russia has, in my opinion, they achieved an objective with the Ukrainian conflict, a kind of deterrence somehow, to say, guys, you don't have ammunition anymore. You have lost all your anti-aircraft missiles, and everything you do, we can destroy them. Think twice if you want to confront us. And in that respect, I think the Russians have achieved an objective. Now, if we take the point of view of the US, during the Cold War, we had a similar situation. And nobody wanted to have neither a nuclear nor a conventional confrontation between NATO or US and the Soviet Union. But what happened? We had, in fact, indirect warfare. We had guerrilla warfare in the rest of the world. That was an indirect way to address your enemy, was to use this kind of indirect. And that's probably what we might have in the future. Probably not with guerrillas as we had in the 60s and in the 70s, in the Far East, in Africa, and in even Latin America. But it will probably be an indirect warfare based on economic warfare. And that's probably what we are seeing when we saw this kind of guerrilla with sanctions, trying to sanction countries. I mean, if the country XYZ tries to help the Chinese, we sanction them and so on. So that, I think we will have this kind of warfare. And we are seeing now this kind of warfare developing. It's the weaponization of economy, if you want, for the sake of war. And that's somehow what you have from the US side when they try to gain the support of people in the Far East, for instance. You were talking about this possible NATO construction in the Pacific area. You know, the US has tried already with this quartet agreement, and with Australia, it was, I may be wrong, but it was Australia, India, the US, and Japan, I think. I may be wrong on that, but we're 4 countries. And but you know, the problem is that the Americans are the Americans. They think that people help them just for the sake because of loving them. And the reality is that the Indians felt totally abandoned as the American tried to build the so-called AUKUS. You know, this AUKUS in Australia, UK, and the US to fight China. And in fact, you had almost the same countries as in the quartet, but India was just left out of this. That was Korea, sorry, AUKUS. No, I don't. I may mix up things in my head. I may be wrong, but in any case, India felt somehow disregarded when the AUKUS was created. I say, well, now we have an organization. Now we create a second one without us. So who are we? You use us as you consider that sometimes you may use us and sometimes not. If we're allies, we're allies or not. And that's a little bit the problem. Again, we are exactly in the problem I mentioned before. The West use or misuse its allies for its own interest, not for the interest of the members of the alliance. It's for the US. It's a US-centered alliance in any case. So meaning, if NATO is a US-centered alliance, by the way. You know, it's not in NATO, you have 31 countries, but only one is important, in fact. That's the reason why when the US go to Iraq, they could have done the war by themselves because they have the capacities. But in fact, they prefer to have others. So the others are, they put their troops and they fight for the US, in fact. You know, because the Poles or or the Ukrainians, by the way, who were in Iraq, they didn't fight for their own interest. They had absolutely none interest. But what happened is that the Americans told them, you fight for us and we'll provide you some weapons. So that's it. But the guy who dies at the end of the day is a Ukrainian or a Pole, not a US guy. So that's a little bit how it works, you know. The Americans don't need such coalitions. If you look, for instance, at the coalition, I mean, if you look at the coalition against ISIS in 2015, 2016, 17. If you look at the French participated to that. The French participate just to 7% of the strikes against ISIL. But the France, as a country, supported most of the terrorist attack. These attacks came to France, not to the US. You know, you have the French in the as a front line, and then they have the problems. You know, but technically, the US didn't need the French. This was the input of the French was negligible in quantitative, if you look at the quantity of strikes and so on. So it's always US centered, and they're very strong at this. So meaning that it's not a real coalition. It's not a coalition of friends. It's a coalition of me funding you. You know? And that's a little bit what may happen in the Pacific if the US wants to have a coalition against China. By the way, I'm not sure that even if the Chinese Taiwanese conflict, I mean, which is a political issue now, if it evolves in a real war, in a physical war, I'm not sure again that this will be a successful war, because even in Taiwan, a lot of people, they don't want to fight against China, not because they are afraid of China, but because they don't feel like fighting against China, because they don't consider China as an enemy. They see more China as a competitor rather than as an enemy. The West tries to portray both entities as enemies, but both in China, they don't consider Taiwanese as enemies, and I think most Taiwanese don't consider Chinese as enemies. You know, we tend to simplify things in such a way that at the end, this is always kind of antagonism between both. But in reality, I'm not sure it's like this. It's exactly the same way the Western mind understands the relationship with between Saudi Arabia and Iran. We tend to see Sunni and Shia and we see that this is just, they are enemies. No, it's not exactly like this. This is not exactly enemies. They may have different perception of problems. They may have different ways of addressing problems, but it's probably more a relationship between competitors rather than a relationship between enemies as such. Even if in some areas you have fights between Sunni and Shia, but that means what we see in Yemen, for instance, although I'm not sure the problem in Yemen is exclusively religious, it's probably more political than religious. It happens that then you have one party who is Shia and the other one is Sunni, but I'm not sure the issue, the fundamental issue is religion. Fundamental issue is political. And that's exactly the same with the rest of the world. We tend in the West to see the problems in an oversimplified way. And therefore, we don't understand that even countries that seem to be antagonistic, they may not be totally antagonistic. I remember when I was in you know that I used to be head of the intelligence of the UN in Sudan, in the UN mission in Sudan, and had quite a large intelligence unit, which was a joint unit, I mean, civilian and military and all that. But I had in my unit, I had both Indian officers and Pakistanis officers. And everybody was expecting these guys to fight always. That was exactly the opposite. When you had a pause, these guys were always together. But everybody expects Indians and Pakistanis to be so enemies that they would fight all the time. Absolutely not true. These guys understand themselves very well. They were always together. They were always joking together, taking coffee, and so on. So therefore, I understood that our perception of conflict in the West tends to be so simple, oversimple sometimes. We tend to understand the conflicts between population with all logic, with all rationale. And when you go in other parts of the world, well, there are other rationals. There are other ways of understanding things, other priorities when assessing conflict and all that. In some areas, religion may be more important. In others, you may have other factors that are more important. So, meaning that in most of the case, in the West, I noticed, and I worked mostly in the military establishment, I noticed that if I was listening to what others say, we were always wrong, because we are not able to understand all the whereabouts in a conflict. There are so many factors. And besides the factors, the antagonistic factors, you have also other factors that may help to reunite people. You know, in the West, for instance, for when you talk about people who don't know very well Europe, looking at history, you could say that the best enemy of the French are probably the Germans. But in reality, when you go today in France and you talk about people, they feel the Brits their biggest enemy, not the Germans. Even if they had two world wars with the Germans, that they were helped by the British, they still consider the British are more antagonistic as the Germans. So meaning that sometimes the criteria to have conflict is so different from what you may think about just looking at history book and so on. So there are other factors that are at play. And that's exactly the same with coming back to Taiwan and China. I think the way we see this, in quotation mark, conflict between Taiwan and China, my personal view is that if anything would happen physically, we may be surprised by the fact that probably the Taiwanese may not want to fight the Chinese, and probably not even the Chinese may want to fight the Taiwanese. So the conflict that we may expect may never happen because people are wiser as the Western people, in fact. And they may find other ways to solve the problem than just waging full-scale war. I don't know. I have absolutely no idea. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball. But I could imagine that things may develop totally differently than what we try to. And in fact, if you look at what's happening in Taiwan, my feeling is that it's the West that is steering the problem. We are providing the weapons. We tend to develop the rhetoric, this rhetoric of war. It seems to come more from the West than from these countries. They tend to play a more a calm game than the West. And we see that the recent declaration of the leader in Taiwan, the leader, I have the feeling that these guys are not looking for having war. And even on mainland China, I don't feel that these guys want to have war. They don't want to be in a situation that eventually leads to physical war. That's definitely not. But I think if war happened in this country between these two entities, because I remind you that Taiwan officially is a province of mainland China. This is important to remind people. But so that's why I'm talking about two entities. But I'm not sure that neither of these two wants to have war. And I'm sure even, and that's why you have this historic compromise between China and Taiwan, that both recognize that there's only one China. Only the West doesn't understand that. But for both of them, both Taiwan and China, for both entities, there is only one China. This is not that Taiwan doesn't really want to be separated from mainland China, in fact. So it's a different kind of logic. And that's the same thing you can see in the Middle East, when because we see two factions fighting, we think that if we help another one, it will automatically be with one or the other. It doesn't work that way in the Middle East. You may, my friend, the friend of my friend is my friend. That's easy. It becomes more complicated when you have the friend of my enemy is what? My enemy or my friend, and so on. So, but in the Middle East, people can cope with this situation, kind of triangular relationship. The mentality, the philosophy helps to cope with those complex situations. While for the Western mind, you cannot have that. Either you are my enemy or you are my friend. That's exactly what George Bush used to say. You're either with us or against us. And that's and again, this is something coming from a neutral country. This is something because, of course, when we talk about you are either with me or against me, this is George Bush. But in fact, it was even during World War II. The Americans didn't want to have a neutral country in Europe. They didn't like it, because for them, if you're neutral, you're already with the enemy somehow, And during World War II, it was mainly because in Switzerland you had the headquarters of the OSS, so the organization that was before the CIA. It was based in Switzerland. In fact, the most clandestine activities happening in Europe during World War II were directed from Switzerland. In fact, not all of them, but a very big part of them. So the Americans understood the benefit of having a neutral country, and after the war, when it was the Cold War, Allen Dulles, who used to be the head of the OSS during the war in Switzerland, based in Switzerland, in Bern, after the war, during the Cold War, then Allen Dulles, because Kennedy and so on, they didn't want to have a neutral country. They tried to make pressure over Switzerland so that Switzerland could join NATO and so on, because they didn't like a neutral country. Neutral was already Soviet. But Allen Dulles, who then was under Kennedy, used to be the head of CIA, he advocated the position of having a neutral country in Europe, because it would be beneficial from all sides, especially for the West, to have a neutral country in Europe. Because the Western mind is it's either that or this, but there are no other ways. And that's very interesting, because when I've been involved myself in several negotiations between tribes or rebel groups in Africa for the United Nations. And I noticed that the relationship in these countries, the relationship between even armored faction, is much more subtle than you may think. And you have to, by choosing carefully your words, you make them enemies or friends, but it's not automatic. And they can cope with situation exactly as I said before, the situation that the friend, the enemy of my friend is my enemy or my friend. This is the question mark. But in Africa or in the Middle East, or in the East globally, in Asia, people can cope with the situation. The Western mind, the European cannot. So meaning that I don't know what will happen in China or in Taiwan or so. But the thing is that I think stirring conflict in this part of the world is not a good idea, because the West is not ready to cope with such a situation. We don't have sufficient, let's say, we are not able to understand all the whereabouts, all the relationships between these countries. So we tend to see things like black and white, and the reality is always in the shade of grays. Is a little bit that. So again, as I think it was wrong to push, or yes, to push Ukraine into a conflict in 2022 or even 2021, because it started then. But I think it would be wrong to push Taiwan, and unfortunately what we are witnessing today is the kind of behavior. Then now Ukraine is on the side because it's lost, and the West has understood that the thing is lost in Ukraine. They will still continue to help Ukraine to some extent, because they cannot just drop Ukraine like this, but they will continue without any hope that it will change things. So they will switch to Asia, and now they will do exactly the same job, exactly what they did with Ukraine and Russia. They will do it with Taiwan and China. This is, but I think it's, in my view, U.S. is going to lose another war.
Do they really understand? Do they really perceive what has happened in Ukraine and apply the same theory, the same concept to what's going on in Taiwan? Because at the same time, we have the war in Ukraine, as you mentioned, Russia and China are closer than ever. And if they go after Taiwan in some sort of conflict, they have the experience in Ukraine. They know what's going on in Ukraine right now. We are at the final stages of the war in Ukraine. And how they can learn from the war in Ukraine, does that help them to not going after some sort of conflict in Taiwan? And considering Russia helping China wholeheartedly, everything, they're out for China, in my opinion.
Well, the situation is a little bit different. I mean, the issue in using Ukraine to fight Russia, the idea was to weaken Russia, and again, there have been many discussions, even in the US, about this. But it seems that at the beginning there was an idea, and if you read this report of the RAND Corporation that I've mentioned a couple of times, that was written in spring 2019, you can understand a little bit the rationale between using Ukraine to weaken Russia. The thing is that for the US, since probably the not 2010 or so, the main enemy is China. And it has become even more so after 2015 or so, since China has become a real challenger for the US in economic terms, and to some extent in terms of political influence as well. So the problem with Russia was that the US was considering two basic scenarios. Either you keep Russia with you so that you isolate China, and you keep Russia in your team if you want. And so China is isolated, and you can use Russia to better isolate China. That's one option. The other option is that, again, the objective being China, weakening China. Russia is just a sideshow, if you want. And the second option is that if you want to isolate China, you just weaken Russia to the point that it just collapses, so that China has no way to have Russia as an ally or a support. And between those two options, apparently the US selected the one that you just make Russia to collapse. And this strategy, if you want, was based on the assumption that Russia was extremely weak, and it needed much more to make it collapse, because the economy was so weak, the military was so weak, and so on and so forth. So it did not need much just to make it to collapse completely, and even to dismantle Russia. Because there is this project, that's called decolonizing Russia, that aims at splitting Russia into between 18 or 32 countries based on the different nations that compose Russia. Anyway, so that was the idea, just to make, not only to make Russia to collapse, but also to Balkanize Russia, if you. And they selected this option because they thought, after all, this is doable. They didn't understand that Russia was, both in terms of economy and military capacity, was much more stronger than estimated. And at the end of the day, we see today that the result is actually the opposite of what was aimed at. In the case of China and Taiwan, you don't have the same kind of game, because you're not exactly trying to weaken. You're not trying to weaken Taiwan or China, because it cannot be weakened literally. I mean, I don't know how you figure out weakening China, but you want to isolate in. That's the issue, to isolate China, to make China being the kind of a rogue state of the world. That's the idea. That's a little bit what the US tried to do with Russia. It was a little bit easier probably with Russia, because Russia provides commodities, but is not exactly the center of gravity of worldwide trade, if you want, while China is. So meaning that if you want to isolate China, basically you are harming yourself, most probably, and a lot of countries will not accept this idea. So I'm not sure exactly what the US has in mind when they anticipate a war between Taiwan and China, because I'm not sure exactly where this could lead to. I don't see Taiwan being able to destroy China, for instance. And I'm not even sure that China is willing to destroy Taiwan. And I'm not even sure that the Taiwanese as a whole wants to fight China. I'm even convinced that a minority of Taiwanese are ready to fight against China. But the majority doesn't want this. So, meaning that I'm not sure exactly what the US tries to do with that. Of course, a lot of trade, I mean, if you look today at the, the pattern of trade between China and Taiwan, you will see that both of them are the main partner of the other. I mean, China has a lot of trade with Taiwan, and Taiwan has a lot of trade with China. So basically, it's a mutual interests working together. They don't have any interest starting to fight against each other. You may have political parties in Taiwan that claim the idea of independence, but I'm not sure that's something they want to. It's not an objective they want to translate into armed struggle. This is an idea. This is a way to make it exactly the same as political parties in France that claim we should go out of Europe. There's not much chance that it happens, but it's just a way of trying to gather people around just around an idea. That's it. And I feel that it's almost the same with Taiwan. I'm not sure Taiwan is ready to fight physically China. Probably a minority of individuals are ready to do so, but not the bulk of the population. As a result, I'm not sure what the Americans aim in this with this conflict. I'm not sure what they want to achieve. It's just a way to disturb China or to create a problem for China. I really don't understand the rationale. So it's hard to understand this question. Sometimes I feel that in the United States, you have a lot of irrational thinking. And probably not only in the United States, by the way, that applies to the European leadership as well. And we see that perfectly with the sanctions. I mean, you make sanctions and everything backfires at you and you're happy. I mean, this is just kind of surrealistic. And my feeling is that if we try to push Taiwan against China and vice versa, nobody will benefit from that. Absolutely nobody, not even the Americans. I'm not sure exactly what they are trying to reach. And this becomes even more absurd when the Americans try to get Europe into this kind of the Chinese issue. And even NATO considers, and European Union consider now China as an enemy. So I don't get it. I can understand that you may consider China as a competitor, and you consider it as a competitor, meaning that it's a fight, but it's a fight in terms of trade. You try to sell more and so on, these kind of things, but it doesn't mean it's an enemy. I mean, a competitor is not an enemy, and but defining China as an enemy is a little bit surrealistic, especially for Europe. Europe has nothing to do with the Pacific area. I mean, we have trade and all that, but they have no basic interest. The US has always felt, especially after World War II, they felt like a Pacific power more than an Atlantic power. So the Pacific area is part of US backyard, and China playing a bigger role in this backyard, of course, tends to be seen as a threat for the US. Okay, I may understand, I may have some, I may explain that, probably not understand totally, but I can explain that. But for Europe, this doesn't apply in any form. So why do the Europeans consider China as an enemy? I have absolutely no reason to do that, to understand that. And of course, some will tell you, especially in Europe, they will say, well, but we are fighting against dictatorship, we are fighting in favor of human rights and all that. Okay, but what's the point of that? Again, I'm not sure that we are coming to the same situation as when we try to, when the Uganda has a law against gay marriage, for instance, then we put sanction on Uganda because they have a law against gay marriage. I mean, I don't understand that. I don't know if gay marriage is a good or a bad thing for a country, but it's certainly not to us to define what is good for Uganda. We have such culture in our cultural environment. It's probably good to have gay marriage, maybe, I don't know. But how come can we decide for Uganda? They have a cultural environment, they have their own society, their own evolution, and they have their way to, but then we try to we start sanctioning them. So exactly, it's we tend to fight against problems that basically we should not bother. It's we can help them, we can probably advise, maybe, but why should we coerce them to change their system? I don't get it. And especially when it comes to almost threatening them with war and armored confrontation. So that I have absolutely no understanding for that. This is beyond beyond my understanding. We should make effort to promote democracy, to promote the international law. All that is fine, but promoting doesn't mean that we coerce people in doing that. And that's a little bit when we talk about China in Europe, people tell you very quickly, oh, but it's a dictatorship. Yes, okay, but what is the definition of dictatorship, by the way? Again, I'm coming back to the example of France compared with Switzerland. I mean, if I consider the way we practice democracy in Switzerland, and if I look next door to the French way of practicing democracy, in my view, we are closer to dictatorship in France than in Switzerland. So should I topple Emmanuel Macron just because he is not the same system as we have in Switzerland? How far can we go with this kind of thinking? It's just because they don't have the right system, that's their way. I mean, the French seem to be more or less, I mean, probably less than more, actually happy with this, the system they have. But it's their system. It is their system. In Switzerland, we used to have an army. Just as an example, we have what we call a militia army. So we don't have a professional army. Everybody is supposed to be part of the military. And in order to be mobilized very quickly in times of war, we have the system that every soldier has its weapon at home with ammunition. So every Swiss citizen basically has an assault rifle at home with ammunition, with a full combat gear at home. But nobody takes arms because they are not happy against the government and starts an armed struggle. But in other countries, that would be probably impossible. But the culture that we have in this country is that, okay, we have weapons, but it's not for make revolution, it's for the defense of the country. And that's the way we understand democracy. But if you start saying the same to export this model to France, you would have a revolution the next day. You know, again, this is just to explain that each country has its own cultural background, historical background, and so on and so forth. So sometimes things may look like dictatorship or autocracy or whatever you call it, but that's the result of a historical evolution. And in Switzerland, the evolution has led to what we see today, and in France, it has led to something else. But why should we then promote a revolution in France to just put kind of a Swiss system into France? That would fail. The Swiss democracy in France would fail because in Switzerland is a result of a historical process. It's not the result of a struggle and it's a change with the snap of the finger. So if you would push France to have the Swiss system within, I mean, if with a snap of a finger, if you could do that in France, that would fail certainly, because it's not something that the society is ready to work with. So it's the same thing with other countries. And it's interestingly enough, by the way, there is a German institute that measures it's called the Democracy Perception Index. And this is an index that's based on polls in, I don't know how many countries, probably 80 countries or so. And they measure the perception of democracy. So it's the way people feel their relationship with the government, basically, and how they feel in a democratic state. This index is based on the difference of perception between two things. One factor is what people expect from democracy. So what is your expectation in terms of democracy in your country? And the second is, how do you feel, I mean, how much your government is fulfilling your expectations, basically. And the difference between the two gives the perception index. Basically, it's the democracy, the democracy perception gap. So that's the gap between what you expect and what you feel in terms of. So the smaller the gap, the better the perception, democracy perception is. And unsurprisingly, when you look at the ranking of the countries, you will see Switzerland at the top. So that's where you have the smallest gap between what you expect and what you feel in your everyday life. But interestingly enough, within the top 10, I don't know exactly the ranking, but probably the fifth or so. But let's say, to be on the safe side, I say in the top 10, you have China. Meaning that for the Chinese, what their government does is it's not very different from what they expect. And why that? Because what happens in China, regardless of how the political system works, the thing is that the Chinese consider that, in fact, their government should make everything working so that they are happy, so that they can live normally, that they can buy what they want, and so on and so forth. And that's the work of the government, to create those conditions. And they don't care if the way the government does it is democratic, not democratic, and so on and so forth. They say, for me, the democracy is that my government provides the condition for me to be happy somehow. That's democracy for me. And when you consider this kind of criteria, and this institute in the ranking shows that China is in the top 10. And when you go on the almost, not exactly the bottom of the list, but probably the second half of the list, you have countries such as France or Italy or Belgium, because that's where the gap between what you expect and what you get is so huge. You know, people have a lot of expectation in terms of democracy, but the government doesn't make these conditions. So it's a very interesting study, and they do that every year. You can probably find it. This is the Democracy Perception Index. It's very interesting to see that, and so we understand that what we call dictatorship and so on, for some countries, maybe in Switzerland, if we had the Chinese Communist Party type government, probably the Swiss would not be happy with that. But in China, it fits the local culture. People are happy. That's okay. As long as we have, and of course, we also have to consider that probably one aspect of this perception is that the standard of living has increased by 10% each year for decades now in China. As a result, people say, well, things are going well. I have work, I have good job, I have money, I can buy anything I want, and I have one car, two cars, one TV, and so on. So that's fine for me. So they may have different criteria as we may have in other countries. That's possible. But the fact of the matter is that they don't feel like in a dictatorship. They don't feel oppressed because the government does what they expect the government to do. As simple as that. So when you see that, then you see, okay, let's say, okay, China is a dictatorship. But if the Chinese are happy with that, why should we try to make their government collapse? And that's the interesting thing. I'm definitely not a fan of communism and all that, and I'm not making any judgment on that. By the way, I'm not sure that China is a real communist country, but it's another consideration. And but again, that's also probably the fact we are not able to say that because of course, we have this picture. When I was young, we used to see the Chinese with all the green outfit and the cap, and there was this standard type of clothing, and everybody on a bike and all that. So we had an image of the Chinese communism. When you look at China today, it looks very much like any Western country, in fact. And people seem to have the same kind of freedom of movement and all that. They can travel, they can do that. So as a result, I may not be communist, for sure, but at the same time, I say, well, if it's their way of understanding communism, well, that's fine with me, because basically it doesn't make much difference with what I know in the West. So why then should we start to make war with them? During the Cold War, and that applies to the Soviet Union as it was for China at the time, we were afraid that these countries would export their communist system to our countries. And that's why we tried to contain them, because we didn't want to be communist somehow. But today, both China and Russia work as Western countries. I mean, they have some probably a different form of capitalism. It's probably better, less. I'm not making any judgment here, but certainly the system they have is not so different from the one we have, and probably this is not system something we need to contain somehow. And so we have a totally different relationship. During the Cold War, we were fighting against a system that we didn't want. This system has disappeared somehow in different ways and forms. So why are we still fighting against these people? Because in fact, they are no longer enemies, they're competitors, but we treat them as enemies. So I'm not sure we are on the right path here. And I think we are just weakening ourselves. And by the way, the conflict in Ukraine shows that we are weakening ourselves rather than weakening the one we wanted to weaken. And that's probably the same conclusion we may have when we start to make a war with China. We are, in my view, it's totally absurd. It will be an expensive fight for nothing. It will cost us probably lives and probably our living standard as well, because we see already now that our people, if you come to Europe, you will see in Germany and so on, people suffer from the sanction they have imposed to Russia. The Germans suffer of that. So what's the point?
Yeah. Maybe the problem is not the government, the problem is the people who are happy with the system of government. That's why they want to change the government to make people unhappy.
Well, this is so absurd. I mean, we are very it's fascinating time, because it seems that we cannot understand the rationale of what's happening. When you see the way, and especially when you consider this, and even we see that when looking at details. For instance, just what comes to my mind are these this ICC indictment for Netanyahu, and the attempt from a US politician to coerce the ICC and to threaten the ICC so that they change their mind. I mean, we are beyond what we tend to fight for, because it's exactly the mafia type of behavior that we have here in the US. And you see that it's the political system works like a mafia, because it's just about coercing people. And we are back to what I said before, this gunboat policy. If you are not doing what we want, we'll just shoot at you, we sanction you, we do that and that. So it's exactly the opposite of what we figured out 40 years ago as we were in the Cold War. We were fighting against a system because we understood the communist system, maybe wrongly, I don't know, but we understood the communist system as a coercive system that will coerce people, that will reduce freedom, that will prevent free trade, free ability, free movement of individuals, free thinking, free press, and so on and so forth. And what we are seeing today is exactly everything we used to fight against 40 years ago. We are coercing countries in doing policy they don't want to do, but we coerce them through sanctions and all that. We we threaten the how to say that, judges and people who try to make law. This is just exactly the opposite of what we used to fight 40 years ago. So we should really ask ourselves, where are we? What are we aiming at? What do we want to achieve? And I'm back to what I said before. If we want, let's say we want Chinese to change. Let's say we want Russian to change. I'm not sure the best way is trying to wage war through Ukraine or through Taiwan. The best way is probably to cooperate, to work with them, and bring them to us, but trying to coerce, and that's exactly what you said before, that by trying to coerce them, the only achievement we made was to make Russia becoming closer to China and to be today the strongest allies, and probably even stronger than the allies we have now in the West, because this conflict in Ukraine has brought us the idea that NATO, for instance, is stronger than ever. But is it so strong? I'm not sure. If you look at, for instance, this bilateral security agreement that many countries, France, Germany, UK, and so on, have made with Ukraine. Why did they make bilateral agreement? Precisely because NATO was not able to provide this security agreement. And why not? It's not all NATO countries that made bilateral agreement with Ukraine, only part of them. Meaning that if NATO was so strong, you would have found the same countries that would have made agreements with you, but it's not that. In fact, there's strong opposition within NATO about having such kind of agreement with Ukraine. So as a result, we always think that showing muscle and all that is the best way to make us stronger, but I'm not sure it's the best way. We are weakening Ukraine and probably leading Ukraine to destruction for nothing, because this will be not to our benefit. On the contrary, this will be only to the benefit of the country we wanted to destroy. That's Russia. So it's absurd. It's a total miscalculation. It's misguided thinking. So everything that we are doing seems to be exactly the opposite of what we should do. And when you address the question of China, I think we're just on the verge of making exactly the same mistake we have done with Ukraine towards China. So it's totally absurd. We are witnessing really the West failing, literally. It was, I'm belong to a generation, you see my white hair. I belong to a generation that has seen probably the golden age of the Western civilization, where everything, we had annual growth. Each year it was better than the previous one. And we had, I remember the time in Switzerland when I was at university and I was studying economics. At that time, we had 65 unemployed people in Switzerland. 65, not 65,000. 65 people were unemployed. Jobless people, 65, period. Well, Switzerland has not big unemployment today, but still, it's probably ranging in the thousands, in the tens of thousands even. It's not much, but it's still much more than the 65 guys we had 50 years ago. So, meaning that we had this golden age where everything was going well and improving each year. We had better solution. And today we are seeing exactly the opposite. We see a decline of everything. We should ask ourselves why it is so. I mean, this is really, it's almost a philosophical question, by the way. And the thing is that nobody seems to question that. we see it, we tend to deny it happens. I mean, the politicians mainly tend to deny it happens, but it happens. I mean, we see that it's less good than it used to be. That's just simply a fact. It's not just a feeling, it's a fact. So I don't know where we are heading to, and I'm not sure our politicians know where they're heading to. This is probably what worries me the most. I'm not sure that, I mean, when I was young, politicians were good or bad, but at least somehow they had a vision, they had an horizon where they were heading towards something. And but today we have the feeling that people think on a day-to-day basis. There is no real vision. And you see that perfectly with individuals or people like Emmanuel Macron or Annalena Baerbock in Germany, or even Rishi Sunak in UK. They say something one day, they say the next day, they say something else. So meaning that these guys, I'm not sure they thought about what they say. They just used to say something. You know, it's a leadership by Twitter. This is the thing is not the content of what you, but you need to write something. That's what is expected from you. It's not something intelligent. You just need to write something. That's it. And you cannot lead a country or especially a country just with no vision, with no understanding of what the future could be. But that's a little bit what we have. And I think the problem we have today in our leadership is it's basically we have it's the rule of the mediocrity that we have more and more. Everywhere. Mediocrity everywhere. And that worries me a little bit. I mean, again, I'm not so old, but still, this is probably the problem of the next generations that no longer mine. But anyway, this worries me because I'm not seeing anything that would signal an improvement. On the contrary, we tend to go downwards without any understanding of how we could reverse this fall.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think it's important to think about this. The problem is that we think and there are probably people who watch this video and will agree maybe or maybe not with what we said, but those who should understand that, those who should watch the video are probably exactly those who are not watching the video, and that's exactly the maybe the problem we have.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Maybe with these talks we can change the tide.
Maybe I mean at least we are doing something. At least
Yeah.
we are trying to do it, and that's already something.
Yeah.